So hello and welcome back to my channel. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Saskia and I got my autism diagnosis around 2 years ago. And basically after my diagnosis I made two videos. I made a video about the adult assessment process with Psychiatry UK, which is the provider I went through, and then I made a video kind of going through the traits that I had that I guess make me autistic or made me think I was autistic to go and seek out a diagnosis. What I thought I would do now is I've done a similar thing in a blog post form. I thought I would go through what do you do if you think you're autistic. So this is going to cover basically, oh, you might have seen a relatable TikTok and someone's mentioned it to you and you think, okay, interesting, what do you now do? What happens next? How do you kind of self-assess? Do you get a diagnosis? Is there a point in a diagnosis? How do you get a diagnosis? On today's coffee break, we have Little Own brand coffee with some oat milk because I want to fill the whole container, but I don't want to use that much iced coffee because then I've got less to have tomorrow. So first things first, you might have seen a relatable TikTok or you've had a couple of friends who have found out that they're autistic and they think actually we're quite similar, maybe you're autistic. Essentially, something has happened that has made you think maybe I'm autistic, maybe there's something going on, I'd like to find out more. It's not necessarily I'd like a diagnosis, it's just I don't know what's happening. The first port of call is to probably find out what autism is. Like, go and find the DSM, I think it's National Autistic Society has a copy of the DSM and the ICD criteria up. Have a read through them. Does it make sense? If it doesn't make sense, Google like autism in females because they will explain the checklist, or Google something like DSM autism explained, because a lot of the DSM is very much about appropriately, which when you're autistic you don't know what appropriate is. So it will say something like, oh, engages with peers inappropriately. What do you mean? So find examples, find out what they mean by all of this. People will go through the DSM, people will have like checklists. It might be if the DSM, reading it too much, it doesn't make sense, it's not very straightforward. If you're a girl, Google female autism checklist. Just have a look. What does all of it mean? Because they tend to be worded a lot better. No, ticking all the boxes doesn't mean you're autistic, means you might be. If you've had a look at a couple of checklists and you've thought, yeah, that makes sense. If you now feel ready to go and read the DSM, you can go and have a read. There will be websites that kind of explain it a bit more because obviously the criteria for things like the DSM and the ICD are very much just persistent deficits in reciprocal social communication and social interaction. Okay, what do you mean? You're gonna want to go into a lot more detail of what does that mean. Google the specific criteria as well and put examples. That will give you some examples. I think the key thing, even if you're like ticking all these boxes on checklists, the key thing is it is developmental. Criteria in the DSM is symptoms must be present in the early developmental period. This does not mean that you have to have been unable to walk and unable to talk. I met my physical developmental milestones, but I had issues with social communication in childhood. I had issues with like fine motor skills in childhood. I think sometimes they kind of define it as like pre-16 and post-16. You have to have had these difficulties pre-16, and sometimes when you're doing checklists and things like the AQ, it will ask you pre-16 and post-16 for the same question. So it'll say, oh, would you rather go to a party or a museum? Horrible question. Option A, only pre-16. Option A, only post-16. Option A, pre and post-16. Like, it will ask you like that because it has to have been present developmental stages. If you don't remember much of your childhood, try and find a friend from primary school, a friend from secondary school, student-teacher reports. A lot of my teacher reports don't necessarily kind of scream autism, but very much highlight the traits of autism that I have, in the sense that they're very much like, Saskia doesn't respect teachers, Saskia has very black or white thinking, Saskia's really struggling with perfectionism, Saskia talks back a lot. I didn't talk back, I just asked why and no one answered me, and that was me being chatty and rude. Those kinds of things are very useful for understanding yourself and understanding what it all means. Ask family members and friends to basically just, how was my childhood? What did I do? Did you think everything was okay? Because sometimes your parents might go, yeah, we thought you were autistic for 5 years and then we just thought you weren't. Like, they might tell you this. If you've now established that, yeah, actually I think I met a couple of these criteria, yeah, I think I was, I was like this in childhood, developmental periods, the next kind of easiest thing to do is a couple of self-assessments online. There's a website called Embrace Autism or Embracing Autism. I think it's Embrace Autism. I'll put it in the link in the description. It basically just has loads of self-tests. The most valid self-test is the AQ, Autism Quotient. There is a short autism quotient, there is an autism quotient. Do the autism quotient because it's longer. It will give you a number and there's kind of a threshold that's like you might be autistic. Tends to be around 30, 31, 32 in research. Kind of depends though. That doesn't also immediately mean that you're autistic, it just means that you have a lot of autistic traits. Another thing with autism is that you have to be disabled by your autism. Firstly, symptoms have to have clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. If you're not disabled by your autism, you are not autistic under the DSM. You also have to have that these experiences are not better explained by intellectual disability or global developmental delay. Or basically, something else doesn't explain them. It could be that you have a lot of these traits, but you have BPD, and none of these traits were present in childhood or development, so you don't meet the criteria for autism, and it makes sense that you score high on some of these criteria, but you don't have autism. You might have CPTSD. You could have CPTSD and autism. You could have BPD and autism. There is a lot of overlap, and that's something that's difficult to navigate, which is why you then probably want to seek out professional help to kind of disentangle what's going on. You want to take a couple of self-tests. The autism quotient and the short autism quotient are what you will need if you want a referral. If you go to the GP and you say, hey babe, refer me for an assessment, you kind of have to provide a reason for a referral. Sometimes an autism quotient, just hand them a short AQ, hand them an AQ and go, this. Other tests that you might want to do are more so for self-understanding. So there's the RADS-R, which is slightly kind of lower support needs focused. It's more about kind of subclinical autism, so what they used to consider Asperger's, but is just autism. It does sometimes have good predictability for autism. It doesn't really have much diagnostic use though. Same with like the CAT-Q, which is looking at camouflaging, doesn't really have any diagnostic use, more so about helping you understand yourself. So kind of do these self-assessments, have a read through them, maybe get someone in your family or someone who, doesn't show any of these traits to do them as well, to have a comparison. Because I would do some of these and go, yeah, 60 is a normal score, and then I'd get my friend to do it and I'd go, oh, they scored 3. Screenshot all of these, screenshot the answers that you have submitted, and also the final score, because both of those will be useful if you then seek a diagnosis. If you've done all of these self-assessments, you've spoken to all of these people, you've read all of the criteria and you think, yeah, this all makes sense, you then kind of have two options. Do you want a diagnosis? Is it not going to help you? If you don't want a diagnosis, you can self-identify as autistic. I don't care. A lot of people are against self-identification. I'm not. I've got a blog post about it. A lot of autistic people are very supportive of self-identifying as autistic. A diagnosis is a privilege. I could go into this for hours. If you don't need the diagnosis, if you don't think it's going to help you, you don't have to get one. If you want a diagnosis because you want the validation, I'll be honest, 99% of the reason I wanted a diagnosis was because I had spent 7 years going through all of this, trying to figure out what was going on. Something good had to come from the end of it. I could not finish this just going, yeah, I know I'm autistic, but no one else does. I also found my diagnosis really beneficial for educational settings. The support that I got having autism on a piece of paper compared to just having all of the traits of autism on a piece of paper was different. You don't really need a diagnosis to prove a lot of things though, in the sense that, if you want to apply for like government benefits, the diagnosis doesn't qualify you any more than not having a diagnosis. It's about the struggles that you've got. Same with if you're applying for jobs and they have like a guaranteed interview scheme, you can identify as autistic and tick that. You can identify as, you can tick what you want. No one's ever asked me for proof of my autism diagnosis. It's completely irrelevant to other people. The only places where it has been beneficial to provide it has been my PIP application, because it highlighted social difficulties and it highlighted a couple of issues, but I didn't need the diagnosis itself to highlight those issues. Academic settings, again, I didn't need the diagnosis itself. It was more so about, these are the issues that I have. The diagnosis can come with stigma, but the stigma might be there regardless if you have the piece of paper that says you are or aren't autistic, you know? It's basically about, do you want a diagnosis? Do you think your life will be better if you have that piece of paper? For me, yes, my life was better. Not necessarily in a tangible way. I feel better in myself. That is enough of a reason to get a diagnosis. It's not like ADHD where you get a diagnosis and you can now access medication and treatment. There is no medication and treatment. The diagnosis will open some doors, but it might not open any. If you want a diagnosis, you then have 3 options in terms of how you go about doing this. 1, go to your GP, tell them, hey babe, I think I'm autistic, can I get a referral? They'll ask, why do you think you're autistic? Slay, we're going to send off that referral. NHS will take a while. Option 2, right to choose. I've been through the regular NHS pathway and the right to choose pathway. I never got the assessment on the NHS, so that one just kind of fizzled out. Right to choose, Google short waiting list, autism, adult, right to choose. Pick a provider that looks like they've got a short waiting list or that tells you we'll have you assessed in 3 months. Go on their website and find the steps, because they had, for me, I had to print out a short AQ or a regular AQ, I don't remember which one, give it to my GP, and I also had to print out a letter about the right to choose pathway that basically just highlighted how right to choose works and that this was allowed. It took a little while because my GP didn't fully understand the right to choose pathway, but they do legally have to refer you. Third option, private diagnosis. Will be a lot quicker, will be very expensive. I would say, personal opinion, refer via the right to choose pathway, figure out roughly how long the waiting list will be. If you can afford a private diagnosis and if you really urgently need one for reasonable adjustments or exams or something, there is no harm in getting a private diagnosis. If, you've made these referrals, you will be waiting, I waited on the NHS waiting list 3 years and I heard zilch. No one spoke to me, I didn't get a contact, I was even on the waiting list. I don't know if I was ever on that waiting list. We move. It was a disaster. Right to choose, 6 months? Maybe? But within a month they told me I was on the waiting list. They'd given me a sheet of forms to fill in. If you go and watch my video on my adult autism assessment, I showed you the forms that I filled in and that kind of thing. What you're going to want to do while you wait is just self-accommodate. If identifying as autistic helps you get the accommodations that you need, do it. I don't care, do what you want, girls. If you think you're autistic and going on websites about autism that give you advice, if that advice helps you live in your life better, do it. There will be lots of kind of small changes that you can make in your life. There will be, books that you might want to read to help you understand autism and autism in yourself, in girls, in clinical presentations. You might want to start things like visual blocking and time planning. You might want to start accommodating for your sensory needs of having some ear defenders or some loops. You can do all of this regardless of if you get a diagnosis or not. But while you're waiting, you are allowed to make those adjustments. You are allowed to go, hey, actually, I'm struggling quite a bit. What can I do? You are allowed to Google, help with autism sensory sensitivities, even if you don't have the official autism label. You can do all of those things, and if they work for you, they work for you, and that is good. You can also find some kind of self-refer support services, support groups. They will normally take you if you self-identify as autistic. They don't tend to care because why would they? It's a support group, they're going to give you support. Also some kind of local counselling services where if you're really struggling with being overwhelmed, you don't have to tell them it's because you think you're autistic. You can, and you can go, actually, I think I'm autistic, so I'd really like some support with that. You can tell them, I am autistic, give me some support for this. Or you can just say, I'm actually just really overwhelmed by everything and I've got all of these traits. And you can kind of describe autism if you don't want to outright say, I think I'm autistic and I need some help with this. The self-referral support isn't necessarily going to be perfect, but you can make accommodations and adjustments in your own life. Ever since I was oh yeah, I'm probably autistic, I have made adjustments in my own life. I have called myself autistic because I was autistic. You can make the changes that you need to make in your life to be comfortable that is fine, that is valid. Because I think it's important to know that when you get a diagnosis, when you get a diagnosis, that is sometimes just the end of the road, that is it. I got no support post-diagnosis. The right to choose provider was great in the sense that they said, oh my God, these are all these things that we really recommend Saskia having. They don't exist. You know, I was told to go and get an occupational therapy assessment, a social wellbeing assessment, CBT with an autism specialist. No one can refer me to these services because they aren't, you know, they don't exist. I asked my GP in Southampton when I got my diagnosis. They said, what do you want me to do about it? I asked my GP in Nottingham when I was there for uni. They said, what do you want me to do about it? I asked my GP when I was at home and they went, what do you want me to do about it? So, you know, they can give you some ideas of support that you might want, but it's not necessarily going to be that. Again, if you get a private diagnosis, you might get kind of prompted to stay in that service for support because they might have like follow-up services or kind of support services that you can now access. But your diagnostic report might say, go and get some autism specialist CBT. You might be able to find some on the NHS, you might not. You know, the diagnosis doesn't necessarily get you the support that you need. And someone might say, well then why'd you get a diagnosis? Because you want to. Because it helps you feel seen, feel understood, because it helps you feel better. If you want to kind of know more about the diagnostic assessment process, I do have a video on obviously my autism assessment process. It was with Psychiatry UK via the Right to Choose pathway. It was online. Some people will have in-person assessments, some people will have online assessments. I'm currently trying to write like just a shitty little guide of basically so you think you're autistic, now what? I'm not going to charge anyone for it because I'm not, you know, capitalism. If I finish making it, it will just be on my blog, and it will have like some resources, some links, some explanations. I spent several hours explaining the DSM criteria, and then I went, oh God, there's the ICD as well. I didn't really bother. Sorry girlies that use the ICD, but kind of gave up. That is kind of all I have to say. You know, if you think you're autistic, you need to go and do the research, first of all. Second of all, you should probably talk to people around you, particularly because it's developmental. It has to have affected your development, or it has to have been involved in your development. If you want to self-identify and that helps you, do it. If you want a diagnosis, go and ask your GP for one. I don't know how it works when you're under 18 or under 16. I think 16 plus you can just go to your GP and ask for a referral. I don't know how the Right to Choose pathway works otherwise though. This is for adult autism. Yeah, so that is everything. I will link my blog down below and I will link any relevant blog posts. I'm going to try and make that guide today, and I will also link my other videos on autism so that you can have a look through those. Hopefully this is kind of just somewhat useful I'm not trying to like, you know, it's just trying to be here's what you should do next. This isn't I can't decide for you if a diagnosis is a good thing. I can't decide for you if you're autistic and if you know, need a diagnosis. I can just tell you, here's what I did, here's what you might want to do, here is XYZ recommendation. Hopefully this was somewhat helpful of just kind of a short idea of, okay, now what? You know, this isn't a hand holding you through the whole process. This is very much just what do you do next? What happens next? How does this all pan out for you? What are your options essentially? I'm not telling you what's the best one. This is just what I would recommend doing, the pathways to follow, that kind of thing. So thank you very much for watching and I will see you next week.